Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hello, Arnie. Good to
Oh,
be with you again.
pleased to have you, Robert. Always pleased. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi, Arnie. Nice to be with you. I've been doing some viewing of videos just over the last day or two, and I must say what's happening in the United States, if it is any kind of a reflection of reality, is not very encouraging. I mean, it's not anything really final or decisive, but it certainly indicates a bad trend.
Yeah, it certainly does, Wallace. I agree. In actual fact, in this coming week's on target, I'm going to cut across to it. I'll lose your audio while I do. In this current coming week's on target for next Friday, Gilad Atzmon actually talks about the fact that big money is not under any duress whatsoever over this COVID-19. In actual fact, their vitality is increasing, and the wealth accumulation is going bunter. So they're really doing very well out of it. And also the financing. Chris Knight, an American writer, guess who funds Black Lives Matter? Guess who came to dinner? And then there's a list, and of course, with Chris Knight's article, he actually highlights Soros is there with 33 million, not unexpected. And the sources of this information go through the Washington Times, Fortune, Politico, Rolling Stone, Forbes, and NBC News. So these are very important points that we're able to use multiple sources to illustrate that Black Lives Matter as a movement, including that which is going on in Australia and I'd assume Canada, is financed by huge money. This is the nexus of capitalism and communism. Communism is a policy, if you like, of the philosophy of capitalism, of monopoly capitalism, and its exploitation of the masses is its purpose, that's intention, so that they were never able to actually free themselves from the burden of debt. In the end, monopoly capitalism is controlled by finance. Your thoughts, and take us further, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, every centralizing movement of since Oliver Cromwell has been financed by big money. Oliver Cromwell was financed out of the continent. He went and spread terror and horror across England, and then he went to Ireland, and the atrocities there mark the Irish forever, I think. The Irish have suffered a lot in history, and he was one of the worst scourges. And the Bolshevik Revolution was financed out of New York by Jacob Schiff, but he had also been financing the attempted revolution in 1905. So he was in it for the long haul. He was financing the revolution that failed in 1905 and that succeeded in 1917. He spent, according to his son, he spent $20 million on making the Bolshevik Revolution succeed. And subsequent to that, all kinds of big corporations around the world sustained the Soviet Union. There's a series of 3 books, Soviet, Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. Very extensive books with the highest degree of detail you could possibly want. And they had 3 volumes, large volumes of books, and they went into all the aspects of the Soviet economy, demonstrating how everything in it was supported by large companies. I mean, some of the companies got into trouble dealing with the communists, but they continued to do it right through to the Vietnamese War.
Mm-hmm.
While the Vietnamese War was going on, and the northern Vietnamese were being sustained with materiel from the Soviet Union, the West built the largest truck factory in the world at the Kama River. And these trucks were being used to transport war materials on the Ho Chi Minh Trail down to fight the people who had built this factory. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So this is just a standard feature of the economy, that every one of these movements has been financed by large corporations, but primarily financial institutions. Their policy is revolutionary because their continuing goal is to centralize power. And they do this through movements like communism, National Socialism, fascism. These are all centralizing political efforts, and they've all been financed by the people who derive benefits from the centralization. And now it seems as if they're finally coming to the culmination of their program, and they're actually making a goal for taking over the entire world.
Yeah.
And they're using this COVID crisis as the pretext for it. It's really quite astonishing, but people had better wake up to what's going on, because we're really getting to a point where there's going to be a lot of suffering if we don't put a stop to it now.
Thank you for that, Robert. I'm going to cut across to our website and highlight here the PDF library. You can see the mouse moving. And in the PDF library is Anthony Sutton, and those books that Robert is referring to: Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. There's many references there of from Anthony Sutton, who was a university professor, I think, in Harvard, and his job, what he did around that time, was to actually catalogue, and that included the main engines of most of the Soviet fleet were actually manufactured in the West, the main engines for their shipping fleet. This is absolutely incredible, the transfer of technology. So the Soviet Union is a Western multinational, if you like, capitalism construct, and as is China. The very manipulation of the campaigns against Chiang Kai-shek in favour of the communists to bring about the collapse of China and of course the Korean War, to instill them, to hold them there in that position. This is the outworking of Western financial policy. We've got to recognise that. This is not new. It's not unprecedented. It's there for the discerning historian, for the investigative reporter. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, I think when you do a persistent study of the major trends and events in history, you will find a very dominant theme, and that is that they have been financed and arranged through various pressures, largely financial, by the big financial corporations. Revolutions have not been, as many people think, spontaneous movements of the downtrodden people. They have been manipulated, organized by very powerful financial institutions, banking institutions. Was it Manasseh ben Israel in Britain? I think it was. I think also, even going back to the French Revolution, you'll find that it was a Swiss banker by the name of Necker who financed it. And things are not as things would appear to be. Things are arranged, orchestrated behind the scenes by very, very arcane, hidden forces, and that sounds rather conspiratorial, but I'm afraid that a disciplined investigation of history reveals that this is in fact the case. Revolutions do not spring from the people. They spring from people who want to mobilize the people, manipulate the mob in order to replace governments and orchestrate policies that are desired and beneficial to the financial powers. And the financial powers, of course, are concerned primarily to effect or to install ultimately a world government or world administration where nations are downplayed, in fact, destroyed. And so the world is not as it seems. All the world is a stage, I think Shakespeare said. And I believe that the one-time Prime Minister of Britain more or less revealed that too. And that was a long time ago. So it's really a thing that we face. It's a universal, all-powerful sort of influence, and it's the sort of thing that most people probably don't really even dare to imagine because it sounds so extremely well, in many people's view, unlikely, and certainly we are propagandized. We are conditioned to believe that such things could not be true, even though many of the main players themselves have made very clear and definite statements of their involvement.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Wallace. That's very, very important to consider. Now, recently I've been talking to an elderly lady about this, and she spent a lifetime researching politics and also history. And this elderly person reinforced to me that this struggle between power and, if you like, the people or the king or government has been going on since time immemorial. And that even back in the Sumerian civilizations, we're talking 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, the argument between, if you like, the merchants or finance and the king or the pharaoh was alive and well and kicking. And it was always this argument of power as to who was to be more powerful. And you might consider or think, okay, you've got this situation where a merchant might do this or a merchant might do that. But when a merchant has a standing army that is superior to a national army, and this is the realm that we're talking. This is the realm that the power that finance has, that it can exert. I think it's interesting. There's a name, I think, in America called BlackRock, and I believe it's a private military functioning entity, and it's available for whoever has the finance, whoever is the highest bidder. This military will achieve its target. And so it's not subject to, if you like, rules of engagement or laws of the land. They are an entity unto themselves, and they will achieve whatever. And I think that you've got to recognise this, that history has shown us this. If we're prepared to look, if we're prepared to actually understand the ramifications of these struggles for power. And this is what we're witnessing. We're witnessing a pursuit of power that essentially, as you said, Wallace, the administration, not government, the administration of the entire planet will be vested in this world entity. And it may not actually have a tangible form, but it may have many facets to it, many, if you like, facades too. World government through the United Nations, is it? International settlement, Bank of International Settlement, is it the ultimate power? Is it? There are powers over and above even these things, even these facades, and we need to take these into account. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, you wonder what the motivation of people who had such a grand ambition would be. There are all kinds of people who are involved in occultism, and when you've got so much money that you can do anything you want, you tend to go further and further in your bizarre ambitions, I guess. So who knows what the thinking of these people actually is? We can just see that they are trying to centralize power on a world scale. And this is very obvious now. There's no question about it. Now, Wally said that things are not as they appear. Well, they're not as they appear because the appearance that is presented to us is mediated through the media. And the media are controlled by finance. The founder of social credit, C.H. Douglas, said that the press and finance are concentric, and they are. All these big publishing houses and newspapers and television stations and I guess internet services now, they are all running on credit lines provided by the banks. So they have to kowtow to the wishes of the banks, and they don't want to irritate the banks because their line of credit could be cut off. So we're seeing in all these large corporations that they have virtually sacrificed the principle of profit, a very strange development, and they've all become social justice warriors. They're all promoting, frantically almost, the principles of political correctness. They're endorsing it everywhere. This Black Lives Matter thing has the support of gigantic corporations and George Soros, and you wonder, where is the dissent? Well, there might be some dissent, but the media make sure that if it exists, the public don't hear about it, because the major media, the TV you watch, and the big internet services you're involved with, and the newspapers are all towing the line of the financial power, and the financial power strives always to centralize power. And there may be occult reasons for this, but there's a pretty practical reason too, and that is that these people are running a defective system. The financial system is fundamentally defective. C.H. Douglas revealed the defect, and if the population in general became aware of this, there would be tremendous pressure to correct the flawed system. Well, the flawed system is what delivers power to the financiers, and therefore they want to keep that system, and they don't want the public becoming aware of the way in which it doesn't operate in their interests.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Robert. That's very important. Over the weekend, I received some emails from different people, and it was in regard to the creation of fiat money or on-demand money by governments, which is, it's interesting. This is relatively new because in the 1912-1924, we had our Commonwealth Bank in Australia, and it issued, at times, debt-free money in order to keep our economy going, and in particular major projects including the execution or processing of the First World War. So they have done it. It's not unprecedented. But the thing is, it's the fact that it is happening in front of our eyes. For the last 100 years, it has been obscured by propaganda, obscured by the media, and certainly through our universities and educational mechanisms of credit creation. There's Say's law and things like that, where it's always balanced, when of course we watch the level of indebtedness of everyone escalating, logarithmically escalating, to the point where the debts are irredeemable. World War I debts taking 100 years to pay and things like that, which is ridiculous when the actual physical cost is paid at the conclusion of the war. The physical cost, it's already done. You've already executed it. That's the end of it. Why should there be debt for it? So these things are becoming apparent, but in the instance of governments finding a new source of revenue without taxation, what they're acknowledging is that it is unsustainable. The level of taxation is to the point where people can't afford to pay any more tax, and if they did, there would be revolt. And so they're now creating new funds, just by the stroke of a pen, creating new funds, and in the case of Australia, putting another 1.5 million people on the government payroll, putting another 1.5 million. Now in America, I think it's like 42 point something or other million people are now on welfare because of the suffering of this COVID-19. And at the same time, big business, finance, is accumulating to the tune of trillions of dollars of more wealth over that same period, that same 9 to 15 week period. It's absolutely incredible what is actually transpiring in front of us. So the narrative is collapsing of banks actually loaning people's deposits. That's completely collapsing in front of our eyes. The deceit has been revealed. But the answer to it is not to have government, not to have bigger and bigger government. It's actually, the answer is to actually place the power, that bona fide power, the cultural inheritance, at the feet of the individual in the form of the national dividend, because then it's decentralising power. You don't want bigger government as the representative of even bigger finance. What you want is smaller government representing the people. And it's not going to happen while they are the employer of choice. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, there's one thing we have to make absolutely clear, and that is that the people of a nation create the wealth of a nation, and the financial credit that reflects that wealth belongs to the people. It does not belong to any specific financial banking institutions. Banks are accountancy agencies, and they should stick to being accountancy agencies. But when the accountancy department marches into the board of directors and said, move over, we're taking over, I think they've gone just a little too far, which of course they have. And that's just about what it amounts to. They are completely out of order. And it wouldn't matter if it had no consequences, but it has the greatest, because the banks have literally claimed the ownership. They have appropriated the communal capital by their claim to absolute ownership of the money supply, because the money supply comes into being only through the banks making loans. Mm-hmm. And they do not lend money that's sitting around out there. They create new credit and lend it, and then they cancel it when it comes back. And there's a totally different process involved there. One involves the banks making a claim that they own the money they create. Now, how any of us who tried something like that would be quickly in jail, and the banks would be probably amongst the first to try and ensure that we ended up in jail, because we would be cutting in on their legalized counterfeiting operation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, very, very important there. Thank you for that, Wallace. The banks really are completely out of order, and the fact is that governments are not even lifting a finger. Media certainly won't even report it, won't discuss it. So these are the handmaid. These are institutions, are essentially the handmaid of finance. And nothing is going to change until there's a desirous of, in the individual, to actually do something about it. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement, there we're witnessing the deconstruction, if you like. We're seeing anarchy in the streets. We're seeing violence. We're seeing entirely disproportionate overreaction over the death of this one man, of who has a very sordid past, and a very, if you like, it's a really an indictment of the system itself. He's a reflection of the problems within the communities of America. He is a reflection of that, with a criminal past and an addiction and all the other sordid details that go with it. But at the same time, his death, and there is talk even of a bit of a false flag on this thing. You've really got to consider it's disproportionate, the violence that we're seeing, the looting, the fact that there's essentially an abandonment of the social distancing. There's one set of rules for everyone, and another set of rules for this lot who are out there demonstrating. That the law is collapsing as we're seeing it in front of us. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think people probably, or maybe not, because we're so brainwashed, were astonished to see that suddenly, when this COVID crisis came along, governments had access to virtually unlimited money. They were all protesting before COVID showed up. Their budgets were strapped. They were running deficits, and they didn't have a dollar to spare, although they always had dollars to spare for certain causes, often causes in other countries, spreading political correctness throughout the world. But we saw how suddenly money was available. Well, where did this money come from? Don't people wonder? There was not adequate money before, and then all of a sudden there's enough to put everybody on so-called furlough and allegedly tied businesses over through the loss of their income because they're all shut down because of social distancing. And you saw this in virtually every country and virtually every political grouping. In Canada, we have a so-called liberal government. In many respects, it's essentially communist. I suppose you'd say it's extreme left. They leapt in, and they've, I think, created about $200 billion supplementary dollars, and they'll probably be creating hundreds of billions more before this thing is out. It's an interesting situation because people are regarding them as being benevolent to a degree, but this is all borrowing, and it's going to have to be repaid. And they pulled a neat trick because the banks have issued the credit, but who's responsible for the repayment? It's not individuals in society could all be going bankrupt. It's the government. So the repayment is backed by the government's power to tax. And this is what the financial system is constantly angling for, because the government can extort money from the population in order to make these payments. There's a limit to what the bank can get out of an individual. They can break an individual, but he's not going to do much for them if he doesn't have any means of surviving economically. Anyway, we had the Liberals in Canada. They have a Conservative government in the UK. They did exactly the same thing, a huge infusion of money into the economy. We've got Trump, a Republican in the United States. I don't know, I think they're up to about $6 trillion now. Talking trillions, you don't talk in millions or billions anymore. We're up to trillions. And so no matter where you look, the same policy is in effect. Well, this would seem to be an international policy. And who is the inspiration for it? Well, we're not seeing a very detailed investigation of this by our news media, are we? Because they do not look into these things. The news media have become voices of the government in all these countries. They're just transmitters of the government position. And this is true of all the state-financed media, but it's true also, surprisingly, of the private media. Somehow they have all come under the control of the same influences, and they're all spouting the same lines. And it's just a repetition of what the government is telling us. We get all these statistics every day about how many people are sick and how many people have died. Well, where does it come from? Where does it come from? You're listening to the radio and they're giving you the latest word. Who is telling them this? Where is the authority for this? Where was the authority for shutting down the economies? It seems as if it were just 2 or 3 people in the country. And yet there are thousands of competent medical research and scientists in the country who could have been consulted on this policy. And if they had been, they might have come up with a very different set of recommendations from the ones that this tiny minority of people who all seem to be compromised or to seem to have interests in the pharmaceutical industry. They made these recommendations to government, and the government just acquiesced. Well, hard to believe, because there's so much expertise in the world. You'd think they would have had a general consultation to try to come at a consensus about what the best policy was, but they didn't do that. They just operated through their centralized control, and they shut everything down.
Thank you for that, Robert. I'm reminded, as I'm listening to this narrative unfold in front of us, of the dialectic, the method of dialectic, of where you actually have the two sides in conflict. That's Marxist dialectical materialism, of course. And without the two sides in conflict, you actually get no new synthesis. And so it's a necessary part. It's the narrative played out in their reality, if you like, in their reality. If you didn't have Democrats, you wouldn't have Trump. If you didn't have conservatives, you wouldn't have liberals, whatever. It's the way it works out. And so we see with the mainstream media, the media on one side being government, if you like, government sponsored, the taxpayer, and the other private enterprise sponsored, but they're both preaching from the same pulpit. They're both from the same pew sheet. What they're doing is giving you two sides to the one story. The illustration isn't easy to come to grips with, but it for me, it's become more apparent with looking at how Marxist-Leninism being taught, if you like, or Keynesian economics, and also von Mises, the teachings of von Mises, and you realise that, of course, this neoliberalism and communism, these are the two polarities that are in conflict, and that's the only two narratives that you hear, but the direction is always the same: revolution and centralisation of power. Revolution and centralisation of power. No matter who's speaking, that is the end position. That is the target. That is the goal. And using a technique what I would describe as pull, I think, or pill. It's where it's a foregone conclusion. This is the new narrative, and we have to use the facts to substantiate it. Whether there's truth or not in it makes no difference. It's a foregone conclusion. So COVID-19 had to have medical distancing, lockdown, all these sorts of things, false positives with the testing. Only discuss testing, don't discuss cases, don't discuss mortality rate, morbidity rate, pre-morbidity, all the things that really counted. This was pill. This was the technique used in order for us to be brainwashed. And of course, the latest demonstration of that was Hollywood, the celebrities in Hollywood prostrating themselves over the Black Lives Matter issue, as if they'd just come out of a North Korean prisoner of war camp after the Korean War, fully indoctrinated, fully brainwashed, and reading to a cue and on script. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Yes, I think we have to realize that communism it deals in opposites. It deals in conflict, because it's only in conflict that you can get interaction from which you can get further developments, which they call a synthesis. And that is their modus operandi, or their method of operating, their strategy. And it is very off-putting or confusing to a lot of people who really do think they're listening to a genuine debate. But the media, for instance, gives lots of controversy, but the controversy is a phony. It's not a genuine controversy. It's a controversy over more or less irrelevancies, which do not touch the major policies and forces in operation, and therefore the process of centralization continues on. It continues on while people get all bothered about emotional arguments, which really are not at the center as a cause. So that way people are kept busy while their rights are being taken away from them gradually and more rapidly all the time, because the debt picture gets greater and greater, and as you had said, Arnie, the government is taking over more and more of the spending power. And you know, I mean, who pays the tab? Yeah. Or who calls the tune, I should say. Mm-hmm. Whoever pays the tab calls the tune. And you don't have much choice, because you had to go to them in the first place to get assistance. And you can't throw away the source of assistance that you managed to get because you just don't agree with them. So you tend to kowtow to carry on according to the policy that's dictated to you. And so this is the insidious thing about, that's why the control of credit has to be put in the hands of the individual citizen, as not as welfare, and not in terms of government spending, but as an inheritance that is received without any question. that is absolutely guaranteed inheritance that has nothing to do with being issued on condition. The only condition is that there are goods to be bought. There's a certain amount of income that has to be added to earned incomes to make it possible for the consuming public to purchase these goods and services, and that's it. And they should get whatever is required to continue the process or to fulfill the process of consumption. And there should be no question about every man and every woman should be paid for their direct active contribution to production. Yes, absolutely. But we know that is becoming smaller, that those payments are becoming relatively smaller and smaller relative to the total cost of goods and services. And that means that the individual with his earned income is being deprived of the economic power as a consumer to control the policy of production. And that control should not be transferred to the state. It should be added to the consumer's already earned income. And so that the consumers, through their policy of buying, of demand, in exercising their economic money vote, their purchasing power, should be able to essentially control the economy of a nation.
Yeah.
And so we have this problem of the old thing about power, a conflict in the struggle for power. And really the people of the nation who create the wealth of the nation should have the final say as to how that wealth is distributed, allocated.
Thank you for that, Wally. That's beautifully put. It's fascinating to look at this time in history where the money power is so stark, so obvious, an influence over industry, over media, and certainly over governments, and the individual having really no say in policy, no say or no security, their security of tenure, their food supply, their clothing, certainly their homes, their jobs, are all in a state of scarcity, of insecurity. And this is what we're witnessing. This is what happens when power is centralised. The response, the social credit national dividend, is a response to the tyranny of finance. It's placing power, political power and economic power, at the feet of the individual. Now, the Westminster system, the evolution, if you like, of parliaments, of the vote, constitutional law, common law, habeas corpus, trial by jury, Magna Carta, all these things took time, took effort, took deep thinking to evolve and develop. And we're at the stage in history where we can see the tyranny. This is no different than the tyranny of King John in 1215, of Henry VIII, arguing that power should be vested in him and that the church should have no say. And so the church was emasculated under Henry VIII, and it really has struggled ever since with the appointments of the archbishops. And so you've got to consider that the state as an entity has overreached, that finance has certainly overreached, that industry has overreached. And these overreaching of power is, of course, each time is stealing that power from the individual. It's eroding their sovereignty. It's eroding their independence, their self-reliance, their assurity that working in community, they can achieve the results they desire. They can achieve what I call the real social credit. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, you've described how arbitrary our system has become, Arnie, and this COVID pandemic, so-called, has revealed absolutely how arbitrary it is, because all of a sudden the entire world has been turned inside out. Nobody in the population being consulted, some alleged medical experts who seem to be very suspect, coming through with the recommendation for the policy. Now, they're continuing with this thing. In Canada, they certainly are. In the UK, they certainly are. In New Zealand, I understand they've said there's no more COVID there, so they're going to go back to some kind of normality, although I don't think they're going to abandon this thing. We've been told over and over that it is the new normality, the new normal. So there are powerful forces who want to keep these strictures that have been imposed on us ongoing. But I mean, within the last few weeks, a couple of revelations have come out that show that it's a farce. One of them was the studies that came out of China that said that there was not one confirmed case of transmission out of doors. There was one suspected case. Well, there are thousands upon thousands of cases, and they were all contracted indoors. Well, what has been imposed upon us? It's house arrest. We've all been confined to the indoors, which is the stupidest policy on the basis of this information emerging from the studies in China. It shows how perverse the whole thing is. And the other information that came out just last week was the death rates from Sweden. And Sweden, they did recommend certain behaviors on the part of the population, but they didn't impose them legally. And Sweden turns out to have had a significantly lower death rate than countries that had a severe lockdown. The death rate, I don't know the exact number, but it was something like 400 per million in Sweden, and it was something like 600 per million in the UK. The difference being that the UK has destroyed its economy to get a worse result. Mm. So how in the world can they be persisting with this and planning all kinds of new measures and this gradual stepping down from the controls they've instituted when the whole theory that they put forth initially has been exploded? It's just an indication of how they want to continue to control our minds. And I do hope that people will soon wake up and that there will be an immense reaction to this, and hopefully some big lawsuits, and hopefully some trials of politicians who have acted in a way that is so destructive to their countries.
Yeah, thank you for that, Robert. And you touch on, to me, two very important points here. One is the accountability of the bureaucracy for this, if you like, this lockdown. Are they being held to account, these individuals who's come up with these spurious recommendations? And, of course, is the righteous judge going to give you the right result going to the courts? I think this is political, and I think that it needs to be dealt with politically, and this is the opportunity for us to consider such a thing as a voter's veto, where policy can be overruled, politicians and all public servants, including judges and bureaucrats, held to account and thrown out of office if they're not performing adequately, imposing policies. So it really does, to me, the idea of a national dividend, you can't just look at man as an economic unit. He's more than that. And it's got to be political, it's got to be cultural, it's got to be spiritual. He is a free agent, and he must be able to exercise that freedom. And that won't happen while, of course, he's emasculated and financially enslaved. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wallace.
No, I mean, the thing of it is that, what are we? Are we just simply economic units to be manipulated by people who happen to have more power to issue edicts on policy, or are we something beyond that? Are we a creation that has, an independence of existence, an independence which necessitates freedom of thought and action, speech? Because if we're nothing more than simply economic units for planners who appropriate the power to plan our lives, then really I don't think there's much to this life. And I don't think there's any evidence to support that. We came before, we did not come after. So there must have been some prior cause. And if there's a prior cause to our existence, I don't think that any one of us as a mere mortals has the right to rise up and say, we will tell you how to live your lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's a choice that we should have in the nature of things, according to natural law. So these people are in violation of natural law. And the communists, of course, don't like the concept of natural law because it is a thing that really, really gives them a problem because it posits a power beyond them. And they claim that they have the ultimate power to make decisions with regard to our economic lives and other aspects. So we're dealing with a very fundamental thing here. It's the fundamental nature of man, the fundamental nature of life, and the apparent efforts of some people to interfere with that relationship which is within natural law. So if you violate natural law, you are obviously going to generate some very, very unpleasant and unhappy results. Mm-hmm. And we can't allow that to happen. We have to a British common law idea that the individual is free to do pretty well what he wants, unless it is specifically prohibited because something you're doing brings harm to someone else. But it's not, the emphasis is on individual freedom, not upon individual restraint by a superior human authority.
Yeah.
In other words, we assume that natural law applies, and can successfully and properly apply in the sphere of human activities. And that no one has a right to come along as a mere mortal and say, well, we don't agree with that and we're taking over. We're going to dictate the terms and nature of your existence. This is a completely perverse situation where the relationships between man and his God or his universe or whatever you want to call it, or the laws, the principles that operate within the universe, and human beings interact. And believe me, we don't need any central planner or communist or fascist or such tyrannical people coming along and telling us that they know best.
Yeah.
And that they will tell us everything that we can do and can't do. Yeah. We can't tolerate that because it takes away the whole meaning and purpose of life.
Yeah, that's
destroys the concept of responsibility.
Exactly right, Wallace. It destroys the concept of responsibility. You can't hide behind the political vote anymore. You can't rob from Peter to pay Paul. We have to actually have a serious review of our political system because it has been perverted and subverted to the point where it's no longer functioning adequately. We vote a dictator in, but we have no say on policy or outcome, and no say as to whether the results are acceptable or no. And we need to review this. The individual is losing more and more sovereignty every single day. Yes, the ultimate power is at the moment is the financial power, and this has been argued with the state, argued with the people for thousands of years. This is our turn to work this through to conclusion. The difference is that we have the knowledge, the understanding. Don't tell me the research is not there, it is. David Graeber has written about debt for 5,000 years, and also Waddell, ancient Syrians and Mesopotamia and these ancient times and the arguments that went on with power. These are all very, very important things to work through. And the beauty of it is that a lot of this information is at your fingertips. We run a particularly, if you like, active website. And in the website, you go to the PDF library and you will find Anthony Sutton, Solzhenitsyn. If you look, you will find Waddell. He's there somewhere. I know because I put him there. There it is, Waddell, Egyptian chronology, the Phoenician origins of the Britons. It's there for your research. It's there for you to educate yourself, to reorientate yourself, to founder yourself correctly. Place yourself at the root of, if you like, the source of life. And the source of life is God. It is freedom to worship God. It is not the state. The state are men. That's all they are. And they're demonstrating how fallible they are, how foolish they look when they're so exploitive. We really do need to reconsider what's going on. This has been another excellent forum, and I really appreciate you two. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you, Arnie. We'll see you next week.